list, which is rather expensive and continually being updated.
Democrats want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
If you are wondering who peaks the enemies list this week, who's at the very top of the enemies list, it's the all-time returning grand champion, the guy who puts the dick in dictator, the orange Caligula, the tangerine shitbag. Yes, folks, it's Donald Trump at the top of the enemies list once again, the all-time world champion. This weekend, Donald Trump and his administration loaded up a bunch of Venezuelans. They claim some are criminals. They have not been clear about the entire manifest. And they shipped them to a for-profit prison in El Salvador in violation of a federal court order. Response from Carolyn Leavitt was, we're not defying court orders. That order was just illegal. No, that's not how this works, Donald. That's not how this works, Carolyn. The White House doesn't get to declare an order to be illegal. It doesn't get to just like wave a magic wand and go, I like this court decision, but not that court decision. It's called the rule of law. And I know that both of you and the rest of your administration of crapulous fucking criminal oligarchic dick suckers don't understand what that means. But it means you don't get optionality when it comes to the law. Folks, this weekend, the constitutional crisis is finally broken out. This is going to go to the Supreme Court. We are in a moment of incredible national peril because of this dipshit. We are in a moment where we're about to decide as a country whether the law is a thing or if it's all about the whim and the caprice of the executive. I hope, I pray that the Roberts Court does the right thing. But that wasn't the whole thing of why Donnie is the top of the enemies list today. And I'm leading the show with this today because I've got a great interview coming up for you in a few minutes. But I'm leading the show with this today because of one thing. As I'm recording this on Monday morning, at 12:52 a.m. on Monday morning, Donald Trump truthed out, whatever that word vomit, dollar store, social media, shit show, sewage sluice website of his is called this week. A long, rambling, threatening, weird truth saying that Joe Biden's pardons were now null and void, without force or effect. He did have a lawyer tell him those words, by the way. Donald Trump did not know how to phrase that. And he unrolled all the pardons Joe Biden issued in the closing days of his administration. And Trump then promised he was going to, quote, investigate at the highest levels all the people who were pardoned. That's Adam Kinzinger. That's Liz Cheney. It's the return of the Jim Comer Palooza Hunter Biden hearings, part 97. This time it's personal. If you have not figured out that when the president just takes the Constitution into his own hands, because there is absolutely no constitutional provision whatsoever to unroll a pardon. It does not exist in the Constitution. It's not there. There is no there. There is no such word in the Constitution in the pardon power description that says, and by the way, if Donald Trump doesn't like you, he can unroll that pardon. No provision there. None. Trump says, oh, Biden didn't know what he was signing. He signed with an auto pen. There are going to be a lot of conservatives today who go out and defend this auto pen thing. I promise you, 1 billion things have been signed by Donald Trump with an auto pen. 1 billion. Maybe 1 billion. A lot. Donald Trump is the man who argued he could declassify documents by thinking in his mind he had declassified them without any paper trail or proclamation or signature or memorandum or record of understanding or letter of record or anything like that. The auto pen is the thinnest reed of thin reeds. It's an absurdity. The idea that Donald Trump is going to use that to try to go out and launch a set of witch hunts and persecutions of people who investigated his attack on the United States Capitol, the terrorist attack Donald Trump inspired on the United States Capitol, that we're going to go out and investigate those people now who look and argue whether Biden should or should not have done the pardons. There is no procedural, legal, or constitutional method by which Trump can unroll those. There is not. It doesn't exist. I wish it did. I kind of wish it did. Because you know what? Someday there'll be a Democratic president again. Maybe. If we survive this shit. And at that point, that person needs to unroll the pardons of Mike Flynn and Paul Manafort and Roger Stone and every other one of these goddamn January 6 terrorists and investigate them at the highest level, as Trump puts it. I don't want to go down that road. I don't want to go down that path necessarily in this world. But these people are lawless. They are absolutely defying the Constitution and the law right now. And the Democrats need to unfuck themselves immediately on this question. You are not dealing with rational actors or logical counterparts or interlocutors that you think you know. Okay? You are not. The people who are telling you right now that we're going to prosecute and investigate and persecute Donald Trump's enemies, that he's, as he describes them, and put them in jail, and that defies court orders and sends people to a for-profit prison in El Salvador. If you can't see what's coming at you, folks, wake the hell up. Donald Trump is, as always, on the enemies list this week. He is at the very peak, the pinnacle, the top, the nosebleed section of the enemies list. It is the gilded, and by the way, just total aside, Donald Trump sending some mook to Hobby Lobby to slap gold leaf over every possible fucking surface in the Oval Office. It's like the Saddam collection presented by Liberace Designs. Get the hell out of here. The vulgarity is just, maybe I have a different aesthetic, but the vulgarity is grotesque. Anyway, back to the more serious national point. Donald Trump is at the top of this list, and yet he still has complete control of the Republican Party. Not one of you will raise your hand. Not one of you will step up and say, the country, the right thing, the law, the Constitution, sensible order, constitutional and conservative interpretation of the executive's power. Not one of them will step up and say, you know what, I'm willing to get a primary for this. Not one of them will step up and say, you know what, I'm willing to say I'm not going to be a part of this. I'm going to block anything he wants to push forward. Not one of them. While Donald Trump is at that pinnacle of the enemies list, he's held up every minute of every day by the Lindsey Grahams and the Susan Collinses and the Lisa Murkowskis and the John Thunes and the Jim Langfords. Because look, I write off the morons, the Mike Lees, the Ted Cruzes, the Cindy Hyde Smiths, the Tommy Tubervilles. They're just performative shit show assholes. They mean nothing. Ted Cruz will be forgotten in history. But these other people who knew better and know better and behind closed doors are wailing and moaning and screaming at people. They're still publicly with this guy, no matter what he does, no matter how grotesque, no matter how close he takes us to the edge of lawlessness. And I'm sure when people start getting rounded up, Tim Snyder said it today. He goes, if you think that by declaring somebody a terrorist and shipping them down to a foreign for-profit prison is going to stop with a bunch of Venezuelan guys, it's not. It's going to go further. That's why Donald Trump will always be the reigning champion of the enemies list. Well, folks, I wanted to put that in the front end of this show because I felt pretty strongly about it. And now I want to introduce you to two folks who are part of a great new anthology that I think you'll really enjoy and appreciate at this moment we're in. It's called Who is Government? And it's an anthology led by Michael Lewis. But today we have Sarah Vowell and Casey Cep, two of the great writers in this. And we're going to have a great conversation with them today. Look forward to it. Let's get going. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I'm your host, as always, Rick Wilson. I am joined today by Sarah Vowell and Casey Cep, who are two of the authors of a terrific new anthology called Who is Government? The Untold Story of Public Service. And I read it over the weekend, and Michael Lewis, Casey Cep, Dave Eggers, John Lanks, Geraldine Brooks, Sarah Vowell, Camus Bell, a whole bunch of folks who have taken a look at government from a different perspective, and they've humanized it a little bit. And I think this book is so important because the moment we're in right now, where Elon Musk and his incel teen super force are going through the government with matches and a flamethrower, burning as much as they can to the ground. And I say this coming into this as a kind of a center-right guy. I say this a lot. I think government needs to be smaller and smarter and better. But I do think we've lost in this country the narrative and the through line of a lot of the tremendously dedicated people who work in these difficult and important and complex jobs that we know nothing about, and who are deeply committed to something that doesn't pay them very well and doesn't get a lot of public respect, but deserves it. So I wanted to welcome Sarah Vowell and Casey Cep to the show today to talk about this book and to ask them, first off, and I'll start with you, Sarah. You guys are both writers and authors, and as you got into this project, what was it that drew you into this project? And I'll ask for each of you to tell me who you profiled and why that story was so compelling to you.
So our brief from the Washington Post was to just go into the government, find somebody to write about. That was it. And I found this woman. She's from Conrad, Montana, which is in north central Montana, graduate of University of Montana. I'm a Montanan. And she works at the National Archives. And it's her job, it was her job, she just retired, to digitize the National Archives, which has 13 billion records. And she and her core of volunteers, I mean, it's interesting in the context now because we got this job 18 months ago. A lot of what she was doing, and I think what Casey's guy is doing, is they were trying to get the taxpayer the most bang for the buck. And one of the ways she was doing that is she recruited an army of volunteers to help digitize those records. And part of that just comes from, I mean, she said, being a ranch kid from Montana, where she grew up hauling water, canning vegetables, knitting her own hats, you know, like Montana ranch people do. And her whole reason for being was sharing the records of the American people with the American people, because most of them are in DC or Maryland or at, you know, a few of these regional archives, and digitizing makes the whole archives more fair and available to everyone, whether you live in Alaska or Bethesda.
Yes. And this is the kind of government job that is unremarked and unnoticed by most people. They just don't wake up in the morning and think, wow, there's somebody trying to make every piece of government information available to everybody in the country. And it's easy to caricature like, oh, these bureaucrats who are spending so much money on DEI, when it's actually a lot of people like that.
The National Archives, you know, according to some, is underfunded, like most government agencies, by half. And, you know, like one of the ways she tried to get around that was partnering with corporations like Ancestry.com. And some people have a problem with that, but these records just wouldn't have been, you know, made available otherwise.
Right. So Casey, tell us about, your chapter was called The Sentinel. And I found it kind of a little heartbreaking given what's happening right now with veterans in the country. Tell us about the man you profiled.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly become more and more poignant to think about the career of someone. I wrote about a man named Ronald Walters, and he's been with VA for 40 years. And Ron has worked the majority of those years with an agency probably many of us had never heard of, the National Cemetery Administration. And the NCA is this tiny little part of VA, and they bury 140,000 veterans and their family members every year. And they tend to 155 national cemeteries around the country, not just in DC. So right away, the stereotype of the bureaucrat who's in Washington who only serves political interests, Ron and his colleagues, there are about 2,300 of them who manage these cemeteries. They're in almost every state, they're in almost every territory, and they tend to the perpetual memory of 4 million American heroes. And what's incredible about Ron, from the moment you meet him, he's the least political person. And I don't mean that he doesn't have politics, but he has seen his entire career as a service to the VA mission, not to any given administration or political party. And I think when he goes to work every day, he's connected to the deep values of this country, going back to Lincoln and Washington, of who we are and the sacrifices that made us who we are. And it's heartbreaking to see his part of the VA or any part of the VA politicized or reduced to partisanship, because just the NCA alone, 65% of these people are veterans themselves. They are so mission oriented. They did not look for a government job in the sense of, oh, I want to serve the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or the Libertarian Party. The agenda they want to advance is serving their fellow veterans. And so, Ron, I mean, why I chose him, I come from a military family. My grandfather served in World War II. Two of my uncles were in the Army, one of them lifelong Marine. I grew up in a place where I think, again, kind of anathema to the stereotype, like, I'm a journalist, but I grew up truly like in the spirit of the Alan Jackson song, like, bow your head to Jesus, stand up for Uncle Sam. Like, this is the part of the country I'm from. We are extremely patriotic, and part of that patriotism has always been tied to honoring the troops and supporting our veterans. So I felt called to Ron in a kind of deep calling to deep way. But the other thing I loved about Ron, and this work would be meaningful no matter how well he and his colleagues did it, but they do their work better than anyone in the private sector included. So, part of this profile isn't just, okay.
Like literally, they're
literally, quantifiably, the University of Michigan Business School, which goes around every year, collecting this data on behalf of Chick-fil-A and Costco and Walmart and every corporation that's trying to empty your pockets. They also survey the federal agencies and government agencies. And the NCA, you think of most agencies like the IRS or whatever, they get like a 68 on this 100-point scale. Ron and his colleagues have gotten a 97. They have topped this survey for 7 consecutive surveys, again, outpacing every private sector company who spends millions of dollars on advertising and PR. Here's this little part of the VA that just goes around trying to do their job well. So I loved Ron because the work itself is so meaningful. And I think it's part of what makes this country actually great. It's not, of course we could survive if we didn't repatriate our military dead and we didn't create shrines and monuments to peace like Arlington or Gettysburg or any of these places we've consecrated. But of course we should, and we can. And not only should we create them, we should tend to them and nourish them and bring our young people into them. And so I loved Ron kind of top to bottom. And Sarah, you put it beautifully, like what our task was. I keep saying our job was to fall in love with a bureaucrat. And I just fell in love with Ron and the work that he does. So it was really just a gift to write about him. But you're right, Rick, it's a heartbreaking thing to look back on now, because we're dealing with people who politicize Arlington, who attack the VA, who reduce funding even for these, incredibly non-political repositories of American life.
Well, I mean, one reason I think people are latching on to this project is how rare it is. And part of that is the press's fault, but part of that are these people's fault. Like, I mean, your guy, Ron, my woman, her name was Pamela Wright. They're very modest people. I mean, you talk about Casey going to interview Ron and he just wanted to tell you about all the people he works with and what they're doing. My person made me spend 2 days following her around 2 different National Archives installations talking to literally everyone underneath her in the org chart. And I mean, that is why she's a great leader. And that's why Ron is a great leader, it sounds like. But it's also, they're not so good at blowing their own horn. And one reason we're in this predicament we're in right now is because the federal government has done a not great job at telling the American people what they're up to.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And
bad at bragging is a really good quality in a person.
Right, but as
not in a government agency.
Right, but as when they're trying to tell a story that could, mean whether or not they remain in existence at all, is I think I think it's one of the reasons that Trump and Musk have been so successful at this arson that's been going on. Because if you did want to cut government appropriately, you'd get people in government to audit things and to help you figure out where you could save money and where you could improve things. Instead of this, just like this madhouse act that's going on right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think in an ideal world, Rick, like you'd be talking to our subjects, not us, but as is the case with so many of these people, they appropriately see their role as, they're paid to do their work, not to blow their own horn. And they
also,
take extremely...
I mean, I don't know if you had this, but their communications departments actively try to discourage reporters from going in there,
Yeah.
Casey did you have to meet the head of the VA? Because I definitely had to go meet with the archivist of the United States, because why would you just want to write about this random woman, changing the world when her boss is so much more interesting? Or I got followed around by a communications officer the entire time. I got around that by just re-interviewing everyone later. But they're so scared of that. And part of that, we were writing for the Washington Post. And, when people in Washington hear Washington Post,
that adds a level of anxiety for them.
So it's Bob Woodward's fault.
Well, listen, Bob Woodward was the very first guest on this podcast, and God bless him. But the Woodward method does scare the living hell out of people in government. And when I was in government at one time, Bob Woodward was reporting something out about the chief of staff of the Air Force, and that was a learning experience for a young 20-something comms guy.
I mean, I don't know about you, Casey, but I had a very emotional experience with some of these documents. And I ended up bursting into tears at one point while I was trying to interview these two archivists. And it was just I bet Woodward and Bernstein wouldn't have cried, but
Yeah, are you kidding me? I took my toddler to the Newbern Cemetery for the Memorial Day celebration, and I just think she's the next generation of Americans. I wanted her to meet Ron and see one of these ceremonies, and watch as I went for the celebration of a guy who'd been shot down in World War II, and 82 years later, again, talk about money we didn't need to spend as Americans, but money that I really do think makes us who we are, makes us a great nation. 82 years later, an agency of the Defense Department identified these remains and brought them home to this man's next of kin, and the whole community gathered to remember what World War II was about. And, talk about crying. I mean, I admire Bob Woodward to the end of my days, but you'll never not see me tear up, when someone is reciting the national anthem under 100 flags on Memorial Day around veterans missing limbs, or widows or widowers who left someone behind. So I think it's tricky, and I realize why these bureaucrats are scared to come on podcasts, but it's all the more reason for us to be emotional, weepy women talking about how important.
Listen, yeah. I will tell you, when I worked at the Defense Department one time, I went to a return ceremony at Andrews, and they were remains that had been recovered from World War II. And the mortuary guys, the cemetery guys were incredibly dignified, and it was absolutely heart-wrenching. And it was so obscure and so not a news story for anybody. And honestly, I kind of think they wanted a couple of warm bodies there in a weird way, because it was the families, the wives and children of that person had already gone and it was the grandchildren and like a couple of family friends or something. And it just was such a small, quiet moment. But it was handled so gracefully and so honorably.
And completely nonpartisan. And
right. There was no politics there at all. And
completely democratic. It wasn't a 4-star general. It wasn't somebody's best friend. It's regardless of rank and station. Again, our cemeteries are
I don't recall all the details, but these were just the remains of some enlisted men that had been found.
The document that made me burst into tears, and I didn't ask to see this. I was just handed this. I wasn't handed. I was shown it. It was the Treaty of New Echota, and my family is Cherokee, and I was shown the treaty that basically gave the government the legal, discretion to march my ancestors at gunpoint across the country. And looking at this piece of paper, I mean, I had read the treaty before, but looking at the paper and seeing the name signed, like it was a death warrant, and I mean, some of the members of the United States Army who accompanied them to what's now Oklahoma might be in some of those cemeteries, I'm guessing. But just the gravity of we both KCR pieces kind of deal with death and like the amount of pain and suffering that went into building this country and keeping it going. And just the solemnity of how, in the archives case, the way they take care of these records. Like I was shown this wall of glass cases of all of Matthew Brady's studio's glass plate negatives from his photos. Plates. And I was like, is there any reason to ever open these again? And they said no, because, they've printed out all the photos. And it was just knowing in those cases were just all of these, pictures of these fallen men and what they gave their lives for. And then, another thing the National Archives does is they administer the census records and like putting everything together. Like, the census right after the Civil War, that was the first time that African Americans were all listed by name. And those two things are related, and just the care and just sacred quality of the whole thing. And they take it so seriously. I mean, my subject, Pam Wright, we talked about, we looked at the first law, which the Congress passed, which is to take an oath to defend the Constitution. And she talked about, how seriously she took that.
Well, I think, I love the Dave Eggers chapter as a nerd, as an aviation and space nerd. I love the Dave Eggers chapter about the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab. I loved both of your chapters as well, because you're right. Your both chapters are both ironically about death and history. And as a country, if you don't honor and memorialize both of those things, for all that the current moment, people seem to want to say like we can erase everything and it's year zero. We're going to start this totally new system. The country did these things, and Sarah, you mentioned in the very beginning of your chapter where they talk about during the War of 1812, Monroe says you've got to get the records out of Washington.
Meaning
because we were a new country.
The Declaration.
Yeah, right.
They're coming
Those little
to
things.
burn the town down.
They're coming to burn it down, and that idea that that's what when I read that, it struck me. I was like, oh my God. There's a similar. I kind of had a similar moment, like when I read that the USAID people were being told to burn or shred all USAID documents.
Totally illegal.
Totally illegal. Completely illegal. But it strikes me that we're in a moment of these people in a weird way are keepers of a longer tradition than we are politically conscious of, especially the folks you profiled.
It's crazy. I know, Sarah, you said that, and I feel like we're like morbid history nerds and talk about how bad the bureaucrats are at promoting themselves. We failed to mention Michael Lewis has a chapter where like a bureaucrat at the FDA saves a little girl's life in Arkansas. Like Dave Eggers, they're discovering life on exoplanets. Like, yes, there's a lot of life and glory and abundant living in this book, and it's true though. Sarah and I were drawn to these people who are tenders of history and keepers of the flame. And I agree with you, Rick. Like, it's a profoundly dangerous time to think that history is retrograde or that, we do need a year zero. And I feel that censorious impulse on the right and the left. And it feels more critical than ever to just cherish our history and to be honest about it. And, again, you asked about VA in this current moment. And they're literally, erasing web pages and deleting directories for certain veterans. And supposedly that's under the rubric of DEI, but you go and you look and, these are individuals who we made a commitment to when they joined the military that we were going to remember them and honor their service. And here we are again, just incredibly mindlessly deleting their web pages because they're this race or this gender. And, I can't think of anything more upsetting. Like, these are our veterans. And indeed, Ron and his colleagues every day go to work honoring the promise, we will remember you and we will honor your service. And their work is being undermined by efforts like this. So yeah, I don't know what to do about it.
Calling people like Chappie James, first African-American Air Force general, a DEI hire,
anti-American,
is so profoundly offensive and anti-American and racist and repugnant, and they're doing it at scale.
Colin Powell. Colin Powell. I mean, who?
I worked for Colin Powell. I can tell you that guy was not about DEI. That guy was about excellence from top to bottom. Even when I disagreed with him, sometimes he was about absolute excellence from top to bottom. And I think that there's an insecurity among a lot of the folks that are presently in control of our government and our nation.
They're also like robbing any kind of, not to sound like diner nuance, but like I remember going a lot when I was working on a project about history of Hawaii, Casey, and going to the Punch Bowl Cemetery there. And I mean, and a lot of the like little museums at these cemeteries, they're like staffed with veteran volunteers, or they used to be. I'm sure they still are. And in Honolulu, those guys the volunteers there were from the 442nd and the 101st, the Japanese American troops. Exactly. And first of all, they were just wonderful and hilarious, like most soldiers are. But I mean, they were there their friends were buried there. So not only just humanized it in terms of they have to go be with their dead friends all the time, but just their story and how they were trying to make this claim, like we're as patriotic as anyone. And while the government was locking up their families, they went to Italy. And it was just always not just moving because they were such funny, old guys. They're probably all gone now, but just to put faces on these wars we get into, and so same thing with the archives. I mean, it's a very complicated story. Most of my family who are in the archives, it's not always a great time reading about what happened to them, but it's the truth. And it's, so big. 13 billion documents.
Yeah. And we ought to, if we don't treasure history and we don't preserve it and we don't treat it honestly, we're going to end up with a very, very different, and I don't think a very good country. But folks, I do want to tell you, I was shocked how much I enjoyed a book about government bureaucrats. Sarah Vowell, Casey Cep, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Enemies List podcast today. It's a great book, folks. Go out and get it wherever fine books are sold. Support your local bookstore. If you still have one, you should treasure it. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you again on the next episode.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.